For an analysis on the latest crime stats, we're joined by Action Society Community Safety Director Ian Cameron and UKZN criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal. Professor, let me start with you. We looked at this at the end of last year. I think at that time 84 people were being killed each and every day. Now it's around 68. Do we cheer that at least things are getting better in terms of murder?
Thank you, Francis, and good evening to your listeners. Yeah, I think a drop in the actual number is something that we should welcome. But of course, and I think like the police minister has said, it's not something to celebrate. The previous presenter mentioned that one life lost is a life too many. So we welcome the fact that there is a reduction. And I think with murder, it's one of the most objective ways to quantify the actual increase or decrease in terms of a category of crime.
Mr. Cameron, do you agree? Of course, attempted murders went up. Those could have been murders. But it does seem like there is a downward trend in recent quarters.
Yeah, thank you. No, look, I agree with the fact that, at least it's a little bit lower than what it might have previously been. I think what really worries me is the increase in other violent and contact crimes that could have been murder. Now, we could always argue that it would be unfair to simply use that. So I think we should welcome it and we should count it. But today's crime statistics certainly didn't paint a picture of improvement in general. If you consider the last 3 years and you look at the average amount of people killed per day, it's still at 75 people per day. If we look at the specific quarter, and all we did was do basic statistic analysis or comparison to the war in Ukraine, almost 3 times the amount of people were killed in South Africa during the same time period versus the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. So we are really worried about it. Also, sexual offences beginning of winter, it's severely underreported. It is often a matter that people don't report out of fear of victimization, secondary trauma, the fact that they don't have trust or faith in the police service and others. So there are many factors to take into consideration. Also, then the last thing that I must say, very worried about the rural safety statistics. It certainly doesn't collate to what I've seen. I'm very worried about the categorization of crime, and therefore I would also question some of the sexual offense crime as it clearly seems to have been manipulated in some ground level statistic reporting.
So can you explain that further? AfriForum was saying they're keeping track of farm murders and it doesn't match up. You're saying sexual assault is very complicated. Rapes, we know it's so underreported, but you're also saying there's manipulation. What are the police doing?
Yeah, to be fair to ground level cops, I don't just want to badmouth them because they're under difficult circumstances, but they very often have to literally hunt statistics. So they've got this green and red line that they're constantly following. And what often happens, and I've actually had 2 or 3 examples in the last 2 weeks of cases that Action Society are involved with, where we see that, for example, an assault GBH charge, which is assault with the intent to commit grievous bodily harm, is written up or laid as just being common assault, or assault GBH is written down instead of attempted murder. And then it ends up going to court, and later on the charge sheet is changed because they say the charge is not nearly serious enough. And there are many examples like that. So in terms of sexual offences, we've recently had cases where sexual assault was the charge, but it was actually rape. So it seems that very often people don't always know better, and then the wrong charge is laid. Then in terms of the farm attack issue, I agree that it is much higher. I think the categorization is wrong. If we go and look at farm attacks in general and the issue in rural areas, it seems to me like very often when farm workers are attacked by these robbers or farmers, they very often just list them as house robbery. But there's a specific internal category in the South African Police Service that needs to be taken into consideration. Sorry, I'm saying a lot now, a mouthful, but why it is so important is that if one farm is attacked, it likely means that a whole lot of people won't eat that very night. So take all of the other aspects out of it. The ripple effect is massive. Sexual offences obviously plays a massive role, but I just had to explain how the manipulation sometimes takes place.
Sure. And Professor Gopal, do you agree? It sounds like this would be about educating officers around correctly categorizing crimes. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But before I comment on that, Francis, I want to say that when we have the crime statistics released, there's actually a story behind those statistics, and I think it's the story that we should actually interrogate, which I think is what Ian, as well as the previous speaker, have mentioned. But particularly when it comes to recording the type of crime and the kind of information that is recorded by the police officer who is the first respondent, I think we still struggle with the fact that the information, the category could be incorrect. The kind of information that's provided in that report may not be credible, may not be strong enough for a conviction, etc. And I think you are absolutely correct in terms of saying that we need retraining, and perhaps to even go back and look at what kind of training is provided in the first instance, and are there independent bodies that quality assure the kind of training that's provided at the moment.
Mr. Cameron, let me come back to you and emphasize that is something that you said earlier, that more people are dying in South Africa on a daily basis than in Ukraine. So it's less safe to be in South Africa than a war-torn country. And that has been the trend for years, hasn't it?
Yeah, and look, we have to give context, hey? It's not like we've got missiles flying around, but we work in the Cape Flats often. Or, for example, I was in Alexandra lately, where we've got 2 or 3 cases at the moment. And I must be honest that I haven't once visited those places in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 months and not come across some kind of violent crime scene, whether it was a murder, armed robbery, etc., etc. So the frequency of crime in some of these areas is truly worrying. Look, we must also remember that the closer people are, and this is a basic sociological principle, the closer people live to each other and the poorer the circumstances, the higher the chance of there being physical violence or violence between people.
Mr. Cameron, may I interject and ask if you've also noticed more authorities walking around? Because we know from the Western Cape government, they say they're looking at the crime stats and focusing on hotspots and putting more boots on the ground. Are you seeing that, and is it making a difference to know exactly where the murders are happening?
It's a very, very important question that you've asked. When we look at the statistics that were released today, we could actually see that the only province where there was a general decline in some of the contact crimes and still worrying statistics was the Western Cape. Now, and I can just say what my personal experience was. There are areas that I think are still skipped, that don't get the attention that they deserve, places like Bonteheuwel, Mfuleni, Manenberg, etc. But what I can say, and what I've personally seen on the ground, is that you do see more patrols happening. You do see more uniformed members walking around. But here's the thing. They don't have investigative power. So how do we make sure the investigation is done adequately, taken to court, and prosecution happens effectively? Uniformed members can only help up to a certain point. We need to make sure that we've got good convictions.
All right, Professor, let me give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But in these crime stats, the most murders were reported at the Inanda and Umlazi police stations in KwaZulu-Natal. So we also have to talk about KwaZulu-Natal, then in the Western Cape, Delft and Gugulethu. So we know where things are happening. Is the response to the crime stats sufficient?
No, in terms of the response, definitely not. It's not sufficient. We look at Inanda, and I think previously Inanda has come up quite high in terms of murder rates. I just worry, about the fact that, for example, Western Cape, I know at the moment is receiving a great deal of attention, because we do understand that almost on a daily basis you hear in the media of, the gang wars and drug-related murders, etc. And I don't think we have enough of that in terms of the response to how the police are actually mitigating in areas like Inanda. It's not in the news. You don't ever hear, or you hardly ever hear about Inanda in the news, whilst the Western Cape we hear so much about. And so if you're talking about is the response to that kind of statistic, is that a good one? And I would say it's not a good one because we don't get to hear exactly what the interventions are in terms of reducing murder in for example, Inanda.
Yeah, and this is something that maybe we should be asking as the media as well, looking at specific areas that are named, Inanda and Umlazi topping the list of murder hotspots. Thank you very much, Action Society Community Safety Director Ian Cameron and UKZN criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal.